So here we go. We used to say good morning, good afternoon, good night. Depends on the place, where and when you are listening to us. Welcome everybody. This is the first session with guest of this fourth edition of the Civic Design course. We are very happy today because we have uh, a very special guest. We have with us Primavera De Filippi. Hi Primavera, how are you?
Hi, everything's good. Thank you.
Primavera is connected from Paris, and we have also in this hangout Juan. Hi Juan, how are you? Domenico, hi Domenico. Anna also is connected, and Nicolas. Hi everyone. And for this fourth edition of the Civic Design course, we are going to test a new way to do these sessions with guests. We are connect in every session. We are going to connect to one or more than one species. Today we are connected with Collector Space in Valencia. Hi everyone there.
Hello
Collector is
everyone.
a good collaboration space that has been open maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, no, Domenico?
Yes, we are actually setting up this new place in Valencia. It's a kind of a community hub with a lot of people developing interesting projects. So I'm not alone. I'm here with other people. You can see. I don't know if maybe we don't have a lot of light, but you can see.
Yeah,
Hello,
we
and
can
we
see
are
that.
happy to be here, hearing from Primavera. Hello, everyone.
Okay. So, as usual, people seeing us using the YouTube channel, you can ask your question using the chat. And also, we have a document. We have shared the document in Twitter using the Civic Innovation School account. So in that document, you can write the question for Primavera too. And I'm going to introduce briefly Primavera. She's mostly you can Primavera. If I'm wrong, you introduce yourself after me. Primavera is mostly a researcher. He's a permanent researcher at the National Center of Scientific Research in Paris, and she's also working with the Berkman-Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and she's also a visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. And as I said, she's a researcher, and she's mostly researching about blockchain and the possibilities of collaboration that opens this protocol. So we are talking today with her about this topic. And Primavera, to give you some context, people watching us are students of the Civic Design course, and maybe not all the people have a technical background. So this session could be great if we can give them some context of what blockchain is and what are the possibilities of collaboration that it opens. So I don't know if you want to say Anything else about you before to start talking about blockchain?
I think you said pretty much everything. I think that's good enough.
I just read your
Yes.
biography. Okay, so maybe we can start with blockchain. Um, um, so to start, maybe you can give us some context. What is blockchain, and what are the main differences between blockchains and the most known Bitcoin and Ethereum?
Yes, I think I will just share a little bit just for the initial part on like explaining the technicalities. Let's see. I'm not sure if it's gonna work.
Yeah, it's not working.
It's not sharing, huh? Okay,
No.
maybe I will not share my screen. So yeah, I mean the underlying definition of what is a blockchain is a little bit complex, but I can try and just summarize it with regard to what are the fundamental characteristics of it. So we have like Bitcoin, which was the first applications to actually use the blockchain, which was launched in 2009. And then, so Bitcoin is a particular application of blockchain technology, which is actually designed in order to create a decentralized payment system that operates independently of any central banks and independently of any government. And then this technology has then been identified as possibly being useful for many other types of applications. And this is like when the blockchain technology has been extracted away from Bitcoin and has become just this underlying technology on which you can run different typologies of cryptocurrencies, but also different types of blockchain-based systems which go beyond being simple cryptocurrencies. And perhaps the most well-known one at the moment will be Ethereum, which was essentially created under the understanding that with Bitcoin and with other like similar cryptocurrencies, it is extremely difficult to do anything beyond traditional financial applications. And so the big difference between Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and then Ethereum and then all the other modern blockchain is basically the capacity not just to record information or transactions, but to also store and execute software code. So we can now deploy software applications in a way that they are not run on one centralized server that actually controls and can influence the way in which this software is executed. But we can now deploy this software on this decentralized network, and the software will then be executed by all the nodes that participate to the network. And the difference with the traditional software code is, of course, that because there is no centralized operator that can actually control the way in which the software is being executed, then it comes with a guarantee of execution. So once it has been deployed on the blockchain, then we know exactly how this software will run, and we know that no one can actually unilaterally intervene in order to change or influence or manipulate or even stop the execution of that software. That's the main difference, and those are what we call nowadays like the smart contracts, which is essentially just talking about those decentralized applications.
Okay, pretty clear. If anyone has question, you can ask anytime. I mean, people in the handout, if anything is not clear or anything. So, why can blockchain create cooperation ecosystem? And what do you think about that?
So, I mean, the basic idea of a blockchain is the concept of disintermediation. And so what happens is that usually when different actors want to interact with each other, but they do not actually trust one another, then you usually need to rely on a centralized authority. And this is the trusted authority that will ensure that even if I don't know who I'm transacting with, I can trust the transactions because I know that the intermediary is a trusted entity. Now, the problem is, of course, that this means that we need to constantly delegate this trust to this centralized operator. So with the blockchain, we can disintermediate the trust. So this means that instead of trusting one operator, which is somehow managing and administering all the transactions, we only need to trust the technological system. So as long as we trust the technology, then we no longer need to trust anyone else. And so this has several implications. The first one is that this means that now you can have people from everywhere in the internet that can transact with each other, even if they don't know, and therefore if they don't know each other. And then the other one is also if we can identify different actors. So we can have like a consortium of different companies that want to also somehow interact with each other on a particular interface, but they don't actually want to delegate to one person the power of actually managing all those transactions. Then we can create like this level playing field in which all the actors are actually at the same level and they all interact with each other through this blockchain. So you can create this kind of like co-opetition model where different actors agree on a particular protocol. And this is the protocol that will actually manage the different transactions that happen. And therefore, everyone has a benefit to contribute to that small ecosystem that they have created, because there is actually a benefit in cooperation. But at the same time, this ecosystem is in competition with the rest, right? And so what happens is that if there is sufficient gravitational force, if there is like a strong ecosystem that is cooperating, then it becomes more and more attractive for the people outside of that ecosystem to join the ecosystem, because then they can enjoy the benefit of cooperation, and then they become together stronger than the competitors outside of that ecosystem. And so this creates like these incentives for cooperation, but cooperation under a trustless, which is like this in, well, it's not really trustless, but the trust is disintermediated among every single actor of the consortium.
Okay, so you said that with blockchain, we disintermediate systems, and we use technology to manage all the system, and is enough the technology and the system to build this collaboration? I mean, what are the role of the people in this system that is managed by blockchain? I mean, do we need a social coordination, a social organization on top of the blockchain, or the blockchain is enough to produce this ecosystem of collaboration?
Well, so I mean, of course, someone needs to define the rule, right? So someone needs to define the protocol. Someone needs to define the various rules of the applications that are running on that blockchain. And so there's this distinction between on-chain governance and off-chain governance. So on-chain governance is pretty much assuming it's like the execution, right? So you codify a particular set of rules into the blockchain, and then you know that anyone that is transacting with that particular software, with that particular interface, then you know that they have to abide by the rules that have been defined into the protocol, right? So this is a form of on-chain governance in the sense that the blockchain infrastructure is itself executing and enforcing the rules that have been defined. But of course, then the question, which is the very important question, is who is the person, who are the person that are actually elaborating and designing the rules that will then be incorporated into the protocol of the blockchain. And so there is various approaches to that. Of course, someone needs to create the first one, needs to launch the network with a particular protocol. So it's going to be the developers and whatnot that actually come up with like the particular rules of the blockchain. And then at some point, sometimes, of course, you want to change the rules because maybe things are changing. Maybe, as we have seen with Bitcoin, there is a need for scalability. So the system was designed in a particular manner, and that as there are more and more users that are actually eager to use this network, then we realize that we do need a mechanism to upgrade the protocol. And then the big question is, who is to decide how we are going to upgrade the protocol? And this raised a lot of debates, a lot of questioning, because there is no distributed consensus for the off-chain questions, right? So while we are all this, like all the software, all the nodes of the network will agree on a particular state of the blockchain. When we talk about on-chain governance, there is no such mechanism for the changes in the protocol. And so the outcome is usually, well, either you need to engage into deliberation, discussion, and that's where we can see how there are obviously some actors that have a stronger say than others. You know, you have like those more powerful actors, which are usually the developers, which are like the, you know, leadership person and so forth. But then you have also some nodes which are more influenced than others, right? So if a particular exchange were to decide to adopt one version of the protocol rather than the other, it is really likely that many people will just follow that decision because the exchange obviously plays a very fundamental role into the network ecosystem. So even though in theory everyone is equal and everybody has the right to choose the rules and therefore choose the chain that they like the most, that they agree with, if there is like miners and exchanges and explorers and all those like key players that are adopting one particular version of the protocol, then it becomes really difficult for a standard user not to follow that, because then they are just on a chain that actually doesn't have really any value, right? So that's the big question, is like, how do we define the procedure, and what are the different mechanisms by which we can identify what does the stakeholder are actually considering to be the right solution, right? So at the moment, most blockchain-based networks actually do not really have an identified governance structure in order to engage all the necessary stakeholders. And right now it's mostly done, with the Bitcoin improvement proposals or Ethereum improvement. So people submit a proposal, and then there is this kind of decision or discussion around whether this proposal should actually be addressed, whether it should be incorporated, and then it's up to the developers to then implement that proposal into the code. And it usually works well when we're talking about technical questions, technical fixes. So if there is a bug, obviously everybody will figure out what's the best way to solve that bug, because it's not objective, but there is usually a consensus as to what's the best way to solve a problem when it's a technical issue. The big problem comes when we actually have contentious issues, which are more politics, right? So the scaling debate was not just a technical question, it was also a question as to the different mechanisms by which we're gonna upgrade the network in order to facilitate scalability will have a very different impact on miners, right? So some people were endorsing the fact of having larger blocks in order to facilitate a higher number of transactions. But then there was the question as to does it actually centralize even further the mining process, because only miners that have a sufficient power, hashing power, will actually be much more advantaged to actually mine those blocks. So there's a whole very complex question actually, and we are still in the process of actually trying to figure out what's the right governance structure for this.
Yeah, so as you said, people that have the knowledge has more capacity to take decision. People that have money or energy can control, can have more control of the protocol of the system. No, so this makes me think that the internet, when it starts, was distributed by design. No, the network, and everybody used to say that the distributed design of the network will give us equal opportunities. So now we have seen that it's not like this exactly. And what do you think? Is blockchain going to have the same problem, the same inequality in the future?
Well, I mean, I think it's slightly different, but relate to the same issues, which is a decentralized network does not really have an institution that is protecting it, right? So when you have a centralized system, then you have a set of actors which are actually in charge, and those actors are actually designed, and their activities is to preserve particular values which are within the network. Now, the problem with the blockchain is that the underlying value is disintermediation, decentralization, trustlessness, and all this stuff, right? The problem is that because it is so decentralized, then no single actor, no single operator can actually control, and therefore cannot easily preserve those values. And so what is happening is that because it's pretty much left to the invisible hand of the market, which means that who is really controlling a blockchain is the people that have hashing power. And in the case of those more proof of stake type of blockchain, is the people that have tokens, which is always an economic factor. And so, but because it's really easy to actually accumulate those resources, then what happens is that we start with a perfectly decentralized system, but just like markets, and we have seen it, we have so many examples of that, the market is, in theory, this perfectly competitive market. And the theory of the market is actually quite elegant. The problem is when you instantiate it into the real world, then there is a lot of market failures. And unless there is an actual institution that is protecting competition within the market, which is intervening in order to ensure that no one can actually take over and become like this oligopoly, then there is always a concentration of power, because you can use those scarce resources in order to accumulate more scarce resources, right? So in the concept of the blockchain, there is this very strong commitment to disintermediation, decentralization, but there is no safety mechanism that will ensure that the decentralization is preserved over time. And if we look at Bitcoin, and if we look at Ethereum, and if we look at pretty much all the existing main blockchain-based networks, they are today controlled, at least at the level of the mining level, by a very small number of large operators. which is kind of ironic in a way, because we're basically, if decentralization is the objective, then by creating a decentralized system, we kind of have lost the objective, which is to ensure the decentralization within the system.
Okay, maybe Primavera, we can talk about some examples, because I don't know if we are talking too theoretically about the blockchain, and I think it's a very complicated issue. So maybe if you can give us some examples of context that blockchains has been applied, and how this technology has changed this system or this context.
Well, I mean, there's not much change yet, because the adoption is actually quite limited. I would say that the most mainstream application is and remains Bitcoin, for sure. And again, Bitcoin came with many promises, but hasn't really fulfilled many of them. There was this initial vision of Bitcoin enabling this perfectly micro transaction or nano transaction, that anyone can actually pay very small fees for every, like pay as you go with very small transaction fees. Today, of course, this is not the case anymore. Like a Bitcoin transaction can actually be more expensive than a traditional credit card transaction, right? So the little promises of the very easy and very cheap microtransaction has not actually emerged. On the other hand, in terms of international transactions, this is actually quite an important difference, in the sense that today it's actually, I know from Europe to the US, you usually have to pay between $60 to $80 for making an international wire, which obviously with Bitcoin, I mean, whatever the transaction fee is at the moment in which you want to make the transaction, but you're actually bypassing these intermediaries, which in this case are the financial intermediaries. So it does provide those new ways of actually transacting value without having to rely on the intermediaries, whether it's a bank, whether it's a PayPal, or whatever usual intermediary we rely on. Potentially does enable to cut the cost, even though nowadays it's actually very cheap, like with PayPal or whatever, we almost have almost no fees anymore. So the transaction fee on Bitcoin, because there is only a limited amount of transaction that can be enacted by every block, the more popular the network becomes, then the higher the transaction fee becomes. So this is that's a slight problem. But then it's really about the very fundamental thing is really about the permissionlessness, right? So today, if you want to do any kind of value transfer, you need to obtain permission. If I want to transfer my money, which is in a particular bank account, I need to ask my bank to make this transaction. If I want to receive, if I want to execute any kind of monetary transfer, this is always something that goes via this intermediary, and this intermediary has the capacity of censoring or preventing or just surveying every transaction that happens. When we move into the blockchain space, then we actually enter into this permissionless space. I don't need to ask anyone to make any transaction. I just do it. And then as long as mathematically and economically the transaction is valid, then transaction will go through, right? Now, the flip side of that is obviously that while, like, if I make a mistake, if I make a transfer with my bank to an account which is actually not the one that I was meaning to, then I can always call my bank and tell them I made this mistake, and then the transaction can be reverted. If someone steals my credit card and is then starting to use my credit card, I can call and I can actually recover my funds. in the case of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency, because there is no longer this centralized intermediaries, which is managing and administering the funds, then if there is any mistakes that is made, or if someone is stealing my keys and whatnot, then there is no way to actually revert it. Once the network has accepted the transaction, then the transaction is valid, and there is nothing you can do in order to actually retrieve your funds.
Okay. We have a question in chat. I read it in Spanish, and then
Sure.
I can translate if you want. César Gerardo Rincón is asking, ¿puede hablarse de blockchain sin tecnología? I don't know exactly what he's thinking about with this question, but he continues. ¿Cómo aplicarlo en territorios vulnerables donde la brecha digital es pronunciada o donde los gobiernos controlan la esfera digital?
What is la esfera digital?
The digital ecosystem.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So, do you need?
No, I understood the question. I don't think you can talk about blockchain without technology, because blockchain is a technology. You cannot. That doesn't mean anything. If, like, what is the? Yes. So, blockchain is a technology that enables different types of applications, but if you remove the technology, then you remove the blockchain. So I think that at least the first part of the answer. With regard to the second half of the question, I think that that's kind of an issue to the extent that there is another one of those promises that came with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, was that we're gonna bank the unbanked. Right, so there's lots of people in some countries that do not actually manage to get a bank account, either because they are not trusted, or just because there is no proper infrastructure and so forth. And so the idea was, well, now that we have cryptocurrency, anyone can get a bank account, but actually it's not really a bank account. Everybody gets a Bitcoin account or a cryptocurrency account. But then the question is, unless we have people that obviously can access those accounts, so at least you do need a smartphone in order to manage your Bitcoin wallet, and unless you have actors, you have market players or whoever it is that accept this as a form of payment, then you cannot really do much with the Bitcoin wallet, even if you do have some Bitcoins, unless you can exchange them for real money. So that's why the role of the exchanges is so important. And then you have like all those things about like remittances. So you have a lot of application startups and whatnot that have started providing remittances services. So enabling people to send money back home. And instead of having to pay 7% to Western Union or whatever kind of fee do you need to pay to your bank, then you can get this done with a much smaller transaction fee. Now the problem is that sure, you can transfer money back home, but then the people back home, what do they do with those funds? What if I send Bitcoins in I don't know, like in Ghana or whatever, then I need to have people that are willing to take those Bitcoins and transfer them and exchange them for the local currency. And so when we're talking like in terms of real world applications, until we don't have a particular set of services which can be paid with Bitcoin, and currently this is very, very few things can actually be purchased directly in Bitcoin, then we are still stuck at the problem of, yes, you can make a transfer from one place to the other, but then once the money gets to the other place, how do we actually get this to be useful and how can we identify intermediaries, because that's eventually what happens, new intermediaries which will provide the exchangeability between those cryptocurrencies and actual fiat currency.
Okay.
I have a question, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about how do you do your research? I mean, thinking about this is quite conceptual, and the tool is digital. What kind of research? How do you get to new spaces or new? How do you improve the processes, or how do you work? In fact, what kind of research do you do?
So I'm a lawyer. So most of my research is focusing on the legal implications and the regulatory challenges that are raised by this technology. So I'm pretty much looking, on the one hand, how can the technology be used in order to bypass existing regulatory frameworks, because it is transnational, because it is pseudonymous, and because of all the specific distinctive characteristic of the technology, it makes it really difficult to regulate. On the other hand, I'm looking also at how the technology can actually be used as a mechanism of regulatory technology. So that's like the reg tech, legal tech, and all this stuff. So how can you use it in order to achieve specific policy objectives in a way that is technologically enforced, as opposed to being socially, institutionally, or legally enforced, right? So, for instance, in the context of transparency and accountability and all this stuff, so you have a lot of system of check and balance and oversight and like all these kind of actors that need to like control, like auditors and all these things, in order to make sure that a particular company or institution is actually operating in compliance with specific regulations. And instead of having all those layers of regulation and all those different actors that are scrutinizing and auditing and verifying transactions, then you just, if you can codify specific rules directly into the blockchain infrastructure, and if those institutions are committing to using this blockchain infrastructure, then you get like real-time auditings. You don't need to have a supervisor or an auditor anymore, because you know that they cannot lie as to the transaction, because lying on the blockchain will immediately actually enact these transactions. So you cannot claim you have done something you haven't done, and you cannot claim to have not done something you have done, right? So those are those two things that I'm looking at. And how do I do it is basically I'm almost doing some kind of anthropological work, because I'm pretty much like hanging out and talking with like actual blockchain developers and blockchain lawyers and like all the people that are actually part of the ecosystem, talking with them, discussing ideas with them, and also trying to get the hands dirty with the technology, because I feel that the only way you really can understand how to regulate the technology, or how you cannot regulate it, or how you can use it as a regulatory technology, is by really having a very a decent understanding of how the technology works, as opposed to just talking policy in general terms. And then the other thing is the governance. So I'm increasingly kind of shifting my focus a little bit away from the law and more about the governance. Because if we do have the systems that are actually difficult to regulate, then the question becomes much more important: is what is the self-governance? What are the mechanisms by which people using or around a blockchain community coordinate themselves? And how do they end up into a particular decision when there is no third party that can actually enforce any kind of decisions?
Juan and Alfonso, hello. I have a question, if it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I'm really interested in the civic implication of the blockchain. So I understand that this kind of technology producing a strong decentralization could be used for new new way to democratize, let's say, civic processes. So I would like to know if you are aware about interesting projects that are working on this kind of approach, and in your opinion, there is a real opportunity in this sense, taking account all of you already said about, for instance, Bitcoin, and we are in the same situation now with the civic approach we had in the past with Bitcoin, or we could be more optimistic?
It's hard to tell. There's a bunch of projects that are actually emerging, which are, I mean, civic can go into many different directions, right? But it's really about getting communities to self-coordinate and self-organize without having to rely on this traditional trusted authority or intermediary application. So there is quite a lot, actually. There's a lot of projects and initiatives that are being launched. One of them, which I'm actually very highly involved with, which is DAOstack. There is Aragon, there is Colony, which are all about creating those decentralized autonomous organizations. And the idea is how, like, designing specific governance structure within those organizations so that there is no hierarchical structure, but it's just more of a cooperative model. But it's a cooperative model where the rules of the cooperative are endorsed and automatically executed by the technology. And then in terms of civics, there is also a lot of discussion going on about providing some more reliable voting system or polling system and so forth. So with, again, the difficulty that, of course, it's very complex to create a blockchain-based voting system, which maintain, like, so you can use them in order to get a verifiability. So I can verify that my particular vote was counted because there is a traceability through the blockchain. And it's great when you want to make surveys, when you want to make perhaps referendum and things like this. It's much more complicated when we move into the traditional, election-style voting systems, because it's actually very difficult to have both verifiability and secrecy or incorruptibility at the same time. So there is some initiatives that are, working on that. Again, I don't know of anyone that is actually like full-fledged, tested and verified, and that really has been mainstreamly adopted. But there is a lot of research going on, and then, like, together combining blockchain with some other cryptographic mechanisms like homomorphic encryption or zero knowledge proof and so forth, in order to try and achieve both this form of verifiability and a decent degree of secrecy and incorruptibility, as in I should not be able to prove who I have voted for, otherwise I can be bribed into voting something, right? So yeah, I mean, there is an increasing number of applications and initiatives that are being developed in this term, but at the same time, very few of them so far, at least, have really reached mainstream adoption. So we remain still into some kind of experimental level, more like proof of concept to show this is possible. But then the devil is always in the details, and it's more about how are we actually going to implement this, and whether it will be able to scale, and like all those very difficult questions, which are both technical and governance-wise, still need to be resolved.
Nicola, you have a question, I guess, and also Juan, maybe, because you have to go, no, Juan?
Yeah, I have to leave.
To your question. Okay.
Sorry, but I'm really enjoying the talk. Thank you very much.
So can I ask my question now?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Filippa. I have two questions, but maybe only one. It's kind of technical question of something I'm not sure to have understand about the Bitcoin and the blockchain and the scalability you were talking about. What I understood about the blockchain, I mean, in the context of the Bitcoin. So you will tell me if this is if the blockchain is the same in any other blockchains. It's that the fact that you're recording everything everywhere on every computer, on every people of the network, and so that's as I understood the problem of scaling, because you waste a lot of information and energy. So first, did I understood well about this? And second, is it an issue we can find in the other blockchains? Is it a problem inherent to any blockchains? Am I clear?
Sure. So there are different mechanisms for validating transactions, right? So Bitcoin has introduced the notion of proof of work, which is basically depending on the amount of hashing power that the network will engage, then different people will be selected to validate the blocks. And this creates this kind of race in which every single node on the network is trying to invest as much computational resources as possible in order to be the selected one that will be asked to validate a block. And of course, the person that validates the block is compensated with some Bitcoins. And so this is the economic incentive that is encouraging everyone to try and contribute to maintaining the security of the network. So the way you can see it is a little bit of this kind of the tropical forest, right? So you have trees, and every tree needs to be higher than the other in order to get sun. And what happens is that you have all those trees that just become absolutely humongous because they are all fighting for getting the sun. And then as soon as one gets higher, the other needs to get higher and higher and higher. And so eventually you're spending a lot of resources just to compete with each other, when eventually everybody gets exactly the same as if they were all at the ground level, right? So with Bitcoin, it's kind of the same. Everyone is just expanding more and more computational resources because they want to be faster than the other in order to validate the block before anyone else, and therefore be compensated with Bitcoins. And the result is that you just have this constant race and this very high consumption of energy for essentially just validating blocks. Now, the reason why this is good in some respect is because this is what is actually ensuring the security of the network. So the higher the amount of computational resources that are invested in the network, then the more expensive it becomes to actually try and hack the network, right? So if anyone managed to control more than 50% of the overall computational power of the network, then they will be able to actually manipulate the blocks. And therefore, this will actually the system will no longer be a trusted system, right? It means that one person can unilaterally censor transactions or revert transactions, which is completely unacceptable in the Bitcoin model. So even though, of course, it has like incredible amount of energy consumption, then this energy consumption is actually part of the security of the network. Now, of course, we can argue whether this is justifiable or not. That's a very different question. But so the problem with the scalability is kind of like as the network gets more and more valuable, because Bitcoins become more valuable, then more and more people actually want to engage into this exercise of finding the solution in order to validate the block. And therefore, the more and more computational resources are being wasted. And wasted is not the right word, because it's actually not completely wasted. It's just expanded for maintaining the security of the network. So that's one problem that relates to scalability. And this is common to all the blockchains that are relying on the proof of work. Right? There are different mechanisms, different validation and consensus protocol systems, which do not rely on proof of work, but they rely on proof of stake, most notably. And in that case, you don't actually need to consume that much energy, because what matters is not the amount of hashing power that you invest in the network, it's the amount of
the proof of what?
Proof of stake.
Stake.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
So you can purchase tokens, and the more tokens you have, the more likely you're going to be asked to validate a block. And so again, this obviously can lead to high centralization, but the underlying understanding is that someone that actually holds a lot of tokens has much lower incentives to cheat or to manipulate the network, because if someone actually manipulates the network, then the value of those tokens will crash. And so there is this economic structure, economic incentivization system by which the people that have the highest amount of token are probably the ones that are the most likely to respect the protocol and not try to actually co-opt the system. Now, the other problem of scalability is the question of the block size. So, for instance, if you can hold, so in Bitcoin, you have one block every 10 minutes as an average, and then there is a particular size that the block that every block can be. And so this means that you only have a particular number of transactions that can be processed every 10 minutes, right? So that's another scalability problem. It's like, what happens is that if there is too many people that want to use the network, then not all transactions can go through, and therefore you need to pay more transaction fees in order to incentivize the miners to process your transaction rather than the one of someone else. And this is why, for instance, like back in last year, because there was so much demand and because the value of Bitcoin was so high, then there was a point in which it costed about $60 to actually validate, to execute a transaction on the blockchain, because there was too much competition. Everybody wanted their transaction to be incorporated into the next block. And so the value of the transaction fee just goes higher and higher. And so that's another type of scalability problem, which is actually, this one is common to all the blockchain, because all the blockchain, they have a particular block size and they have a particular speed at which blocks can be validated.
Okay, Primavera. We have just 3 more minutes, and we have a lot of questions. Maybe we are going to finish with one question from Juan. He asked before leaving that all the outcomes of your investigation about governance, are they applicable to other contexts, not necessarily than in the digital context, but also offline context? And there is also another question in the chat in YouTube. Maria Ines is asking, for a better understanding, it's possible to take a look at the organization and initiative that you've been talking about. She's asking for links.
Sure. So
maybe we can you can give a list or something.
Yes. So I mean, to answer the first question, that's a very important question. And in fact, I mean, most of my research is about distributed governance. And of course, distributed governance should be applied not just on a blockchain-based system, but everywhere else. The interesting thing about a blockchain is that because it is a decentralized infrastructure, then it obliges us, like as we think about governance, you cannot think about a centralized governance system and deploy it on a decentralized infrastructure. So the interesting thing about the blockchain is that it's a very interesting use case because it can only operate through distributed governance, right? And so whether you have a market-based governance, whether you have like reputation-based or meritocratic or whatever you want to think about, as you deploy it on a blockchain, you can really see whether it actually makes sense into a decentralized infrastructure. But of course, my hope is that all the research that is being done within this decentralized and distributed organization can eventually be taken and extrapolated and actually applied into traditional human-based organization, whether or not they are mediated themselves through a blockchain or not. So I think that's a very, very important, very important question, and I think that's really important that we don't get just focused only on a blockchain-based system, but just use this as a microcosmo in which we can analyze the way in which people interact and then identify insights that then will be useful into the non-blockchain world. In terms of initiative, I can type them in the thing. So the one I'm working on is talstack.io, which is pretty much like trying to come up with those scalable distributed governance structure for decentralized organization. There is Aragon, which is also working on like how we can mediate interaction between different decentralized organizations and how we can govern those like the whole ecosystem. Colony, which is also about designing system for cooperative models or like digital cooperatives and so forth. There is Open Collective, which is also very interesting, which is it's more related to the fundings, but it's trying to create those kind of like collective in which you can profit share and distribute funds within a particular organization. So there is a lot of research that is actually emanating from the blockchain space, but eventually, hopefully, once we figure out a solution for the blockchain space, this solution will actually be applicable also in the physical world.
Okay, nice. So maybe for the list of links, you can send this to us, and
Sure.
we can publish this in the Civic Innovation School website.
Yes.
Maybe to finish, you can talk us a little bit about your new book, Blockchain and the Law. What is it about?
Mostly about blockchain and the law. No, it's looking at the different verticals, so the different fields of application in which blockchain technology can be used. So payment system, contracts, Internet of Things, organizations, information dissemination, and so forth. And then for every one of those verticals, it's looking pretty much at blockchain technology as this dual edge technology. So on the one hand, how it can be used in order to circumvent and bypass existing regulatory frameworks to the extent that it operates within its own separate technical framework. And on the other hand, it's looking at how this technical framework can actually be used in order to support or at least complement those existing legal rules, and how we can actually design them or incorporate them within a particular institution, and we can bake into the actual technology some of those policy objectives.
Okay, so I think we can stop here. There is more question in the chat, but we don't have any more time. So just thank you, Primavera, to be with us. And thanks to anyone that is watching us. I don't know, Dome, if you have in mind the date of the next session with a guest. I don't have the calendar with me right now, but anyway, Dome is not listening to me, maybe.
Sí, hola. Hello, yes. The next session will be the 13th of November with Carolina and Jose from Chile. So we'll now talk with the Latin American community, and they will be talking about Espacio Lúdico, which is a really interesting practice, working a lot on public space and how gamification could help us to improve our engagement and participation in practices like placemaking as well. So see you in a few days. Thanks as well, Primavera, was really interesting. So,
yeah, thanks again, Primavera, and we continue to talk in the network.
Sure.
Because Nicolas, more and more questions.
No worries.
yeah.
Bye.
Hi to everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.